All right, hello and welcome to Banned Books, hard-hitting questions answered by your local librarians, presented by Jackson County Library Services. In recognition of Banned Books Week, which is this week, September 26th to October 2nd, tonight we'll have a panel discussion of banned books with the JCLS librarians. Topics will include things like what it means to ban a book, what types of books get banned, and how libraries can help promote the freedom to read. My name is Spencer, and I am an adult services librarian in Medford, and I'll be facilitating this program along with my coworker, Kayla. If we really quickly want to have all the panelists and Kayla introduce yourselves, your name and where you work at JCLS.
Hi, I'll start. My name is Kayla, and I'm one of your adult services librarians at the Medford branch, and I will be co-facilitating this with Spencer tonight.
My name is Andrea. I am the Medford Teen Librarian. I'm happy to be here.
I'm Carrie Turney Ross. I am the area manager for outreach and programs. And I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm Kristin Anderson. I am the Bear Creek area manager and I manage the Ashland branch.
All right, even though we all do work for JCLS, we are all individuals and we want to make sure that we state that the views and opinions expressed in this program are that of the panelists themselves and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. So with that, we can go ahead and jump into the discussion. The first question for our panelists, can you introduce yourself more in depth and talk about your role at the library?
I'll go first. So like I said, I'm Carrie Turney Ross. I'm the area manager for outreach and programs. Up until just a few weeks ago, I was the adult services coordinator. And one of my roles was actually collection development for the collection, ordering fiction, nonfiction, large print, and audiobooks for our adult patrons. And now in my new role, I oversee our outreach department and the programs that you see all over Jackson County libraries.
I'm Kristin Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I manage the Ashland branch. I have a career that started as a children's librarian, so part of the reason I'm here is actually to represent the children's librarian perspective. There is kind of a unique conversation around children's literature specifically, and you can certainly see that by watching the news, that there are some interesting, stories about challenges happening right now. But also as a branch manager, I am kind of in a position to be on the receiving end of challenges when they come in. And I've been working in libraries for over 15 years. So I've been doing this for a while.
Okay, and again, I'm Andrea. I'm the Medford Teen Librarian. And I'm in that fun place of, I don't manage collection development, but a lot of the books that are considered in the banned or challenged area are in this department. So I see a lot of it. And it's also, the teen library is very much in a place of, you're still a kid, but you're also trying to be independent. So there's as a librarian in that place, I need to be trusted by the teen and the parents, kind of. And so it's always a bit of a balancing act. So we see a lot of those issues, but also we want to provide as much as possible. I think as much is really just the way to look at it. Much is a good word.
Thank you. So jumping into the next question, what do you mean when you say banned books? What about challenged books?
So when I think of a banned book, I think of a book that's been removed from the collection. And when I think of a challenged book, I think of a book where a patron or a member of the community has questioned the materials being in the library or in the section of the library that they're in. And there is a formal process for going through that that we'll get to when we talk about policy. Oftentimes people don't want to use that procedure, people will complain about books in different ways, and there's like a specific process that is what challenging a book is, and I believe that that's what ALA uses to do its fascinating top 10 challenged books every year, which is always a list worth looking at.
I completely agree. I think those, people kind of conflate those two things to mean the same thing, banned and challenged. Just because something's been challenged doesn't mean that it's ever actually been banned. And also, when we think about banned books, this isn't as common in the US where, the government actually bans a book, says this book is not allowed within our borders. But there are countries all around the world where that is a very real thing that happens. And so I think it is important to know the difference between something that's actually been banned and something that people have just found questionable. For me, they are kind of the same thing, but there is a very important difference between the two.
I'm right there with both of you. And I will say that in my prep for this panel, I was reading about, I don't know if you guys have heard about York County, Pennsylvania, and their 500 books involving like racial issues in the United States that have been challenged a year ago or something, and they just came down with the decision that they will not be disallowing them from the collection. So it sounds like something that's such an old idea and something that's so like, of course we wouldn't ban a book about, Black people in the United States. And yet we then have issues like this where books are being challenged with the hopes of saying, no, we're not going to have those in our schools. We're not going to have those in our curriculum. So I'll admit, I was reading this and I was like, this can't possibly be happening in the United States. And there it is.
It's something that's a very real kind of intersection of it's the intersection of the pushback against critical race theory, the kind of that broader conversation about that's related to the 1619 Project, and people pushing back against wanting that content in the library. And there were, like, as the person who's the children's specialist on the panel, like, picture book biographies of Martin Luther King were on the list here. This was not like a traditional list of challenge books. And it was, for me as a librarian, my guess is the rest of the panel had the same feeling, very disheartening to see the kind of content that librarians have been pushing for a long time, diverse representation amongst authors, amongst characters in our collection, basically that whole thing being challenged in this one isolated, well, not so isolated incident. So
that kind of leads into our next question, question 3. How do books get banned and why?
How do books get banned? It's, that's usually a decision made by a board, by a political group, by a governing body that decides we're absolutely not going to have these in our collection or have access to these. How a book gets challenged, I think that kind of depends on what library system you're in, what school system. Everyone has their own policies for the official methods of challenging something, and then the decision is made to either keep the item, move it to a different spot in the collection, or get rid of it entirely.
In reality, in my experience, I've seen books challenged in my professional career. I know of one story at my prior employer that we would share around as an example of when a book gets actually taken out of the collection. So the specific story in this case was young girl wants to check out Sleeping Beauty. And so she goes to the library catalog, as one does, and types in Sleeping Beauty. And she reserves the first book called Sleeping Beauty that she encounters in the library catalog. may have been at a time before you had cover images alongside. The book that she reserved was a book called Sleeping Beauty by Anne Rolliquer. She is that's a pseudonym for Anne Rice, who writes erotica under the name Anne Rolliquer. And it was pretty racy. The child's mother challenged the book through the formal challenge process. It probably still would have stayed in the collection. It is a book that is clearly written and published for adults, not for children. However, there was this thing where she said at one point in her interviews that she was that she, under the name of Anne Rolliquer, what she wrote was pornography. And she said that specific word, and this is going to come up again when we talk about policy. When your policy says you don't collect pornography and an author's like, yeah, I write pornography, I write it under the name Anne Rolliquer. If somebody challenges that copy of Sleeping Beauty, that copy of Sleeping Beauty might get banned. So in that case at Columbus Metropolitan Library, that did happen. But in libraries with solid collection policies, we tend to be very protective of erring on the side of keeping books in the collection rather than removing them.
So next question 4. What is your collection development policy? Do you have any criteria or sources you use when selecting titles?
I can talk about this a little bit. We do have a collection development policy with Jackson County Library Services. One thing that is very important to highlight is that we stand by the American Library Association's freedom to read and freedom to view statements. So basically that means people have the right to read what they want to read and to view what they want to view. And so with our policy and the way that it kind of works with JCLS is there's, a group of people who do a lot of the selection. And we have, there are certain authors that are just automatically, we know that people are going to want their books and we order them automatically. It's, pre-planned, every James Patterson book is going to be added. So, there are some that we just kind of have on automatic order. For everything else, we look at a bunch of different resources. We look at professional reviews of the books. So to see what the content is. And I even like, I think it's the Library Journal, when they review something, they'll have this verdict at the end that's like, this will be, people will love this and it's going to fly off of the shelves, or this is an okay book. Some people will like it. Maybe go ahead and get it. So, there are definitely tools out there to make it easier for us to make those selections and make sure that we're adding the things that people are going to want to read. Another point that I want to just kind of, let me see, I've got my notes here. So our selection criteria. When we are looking at books, we want to think about patron interest and demand. So will our patrons here in Jackson County really want to read this? And what's the demand for those authors? The historical significance of the author and or the subject, the timeliness of the material. So we do want to have a healthy collection. And that means ordering new books, trying not to order books that were published 25, 30 years ago, because that brings the age of the collection down. Also, we look at local emphasis. If there's a book about the, Pacific Crest Trail, we should probably be getting it because we're on it. And then we also look at diversity of viewpoints. We want to make sure that we have books for everybody, something that everyone will want to read. And then the authority and accuracy and that's especially important for nonfiction materials. We want to make sure they're accurate. We don't want to provide resources that are going to give bad information. So those are the things that we kind of look into with our collection development policy.
When you talk about selection resources and the reviews and the verdicts on Library Journal, School Library Journal does that too. And one of the things I forgot to mention when I introduced myself is I do also write reviews for professional journals. So I've written those verdicts like, hey, buy this wherever, you know, Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give is popular, which is everywhere. Or, you know, there's code, there's ways to write. I mean, so like just between us here in this room, there's code for writing a slightly negative review, and there's code for writing a good review. And a good review is like, buy this everywhere. And the other one is like where this topic might be popular, or if you've got, you know, a specific population. As Carrie was talking about, you know, thinking about coverage and having things for everyone, I wanted to bring in really quickly, from a children's standpoint, the concept of books that are mirror books and books that are window books. And I should cite the name of the person who came up with that concept, and right now the name is escaping me. And if somebody wants to Google that while I'm talking, that would be really helpful, librarians. So a window book is a book that helps you see a lived experience that's different from yours, and it builds empathy. And a mirror book reflects back to you your own lived experience, and it builds self-esteem. And everybody needs both of those, which means everybody should be reading lots of books about lots of different characters. And sometimes if you go back, like, because I've been doing this for a while, librarians who are, you know, who've been doing this for a while, like there was a time where it was like, well, we need books featuring Black characters for the Black kids, but that's not really what we need. We need kids reading diversely, no matter what their identity. And that's just, we're starting to see more of that happen as a part of, you know, conversations around diversity in literature, but in children's literature, it's particularly a hot topic.
Is it Carlos Ruiz Zafron? Is that who we were talking about?
Maybe I'm trying to remember, and I see someone else say Emily Style. It's been said a lot. There is a specific person, and the specific person added the idea of a sliding glass door to it as well.
Oh, Rudine Sims Bishop?
Probably.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to add real fast about our collection development policy is we really do like patron suggestions,
Yes.
and we depend on them heavily. Because you know what you're going to read even better than we do. And so if we get patron suggestions, there are very few instances in which we will not order those. And it's decided on a case-by-case basis, but we really like to hear from you. So make sure you use that option. You get 4 suggestions a month. So when you go to our catalog, you can suggest a book if we don't have it.
And also when you see us, you know, when you're able to come in and we hear those requests from you, and then we check back in with you later, and once we've gotten them, then we know how to better help you in the future when you're looking for other books. Like, did you like this? Is this something you're interested in? And then we're like, okay, maybe you'll really like this. And it's like my favorite part of my job is making sure people are fit with the right book. So if we can help you, please let us.
I'd like to add something, if you don't mind. The JCLS website lets you log in and you can rate your books. You can leave reviews. And so the more that you do that, we can check statistics of these books are getting these hot reviews, or they're getting ranked this amount. So that also guides. So sometimes you can really, really make your JCLS account. You know, you can kind of mess with that algorithm a bit to where it knows you a little bit more and what books you like. And then it helps us with selecting more books too. So I always like to add our catalog in on there.
All right, next question. Has anyone had an experience with the community or specific patrons getting upset about titles found in the collection?
I mean, yes. It varies, and sometimes it happens in subtle ways. So I'm not advocating for this method, but I have found picture books in the collection where words that people personally found offensive or problematic, they just take a Sharpie and don't do that because it's only going to get taken out of the collection and then put back in. And it's like, I think of the example because when I saw this, it was a young, it was a picture book that was, it was like a book that was intended to be affirming of LGBT plus identities. It was probably a book about a pride parade, and somebody chose to just blank out a passage that was about two like parents being of the same gender identity. And here's the thing, when I saw, like, there was a time when I saw that, I'd be like, I'd be worried about the challenge. In this case, I was worried about that book going, and this shows growth. I was worried about the parent who had a family taking it home, in which two parents were the same sex and having to explain that to their child. So what you do is you remove that and you buy a clean copy like that, and that ends up having, because that's not going through the challenge process. It's one of those subtle, non-challenging ways to question a book's availability in the collection. But it's never exactly what you're expecting. And I don't think I've ever had a challenge for a book that kind of makes the lists. I have certainly talked to parents who have made it clear through and this isn't challenging so much as just making it clear that, as a librarian interacting with their child, like, we don't read books about witchcraft. This was at the beginning of the popularity of Harry Potter, when that was part of the concern about the content of Harry Potter. And, having to like manage, like, so you hear that, and then, like, the parents telling you a part of what you need to do when you're talking to their child, and finding books and kind of respecting that, but still and not reacting, and still finding positive ways to find books that will engage them, that meet everyone's needs. Because the family is, the parent is part of the, one of the customers when you're doing that specific transaction.
I was going to say I have those similar experiences with parents, but also, in a hilarious turn of events, I was one of those kids who was absolutely no holds barred, do not give my child Harry Potter. And I don't know if this is a success or a failure of that system, but 3 Harry Potter conventions later, let's see how good that kind of censorship on my parents' part did them. And at this point, they just shake their head and they're like, okay, I guess this is a choice you're going to make. But it's an interesting thing when you make that decision for your child. It's kind of like, well, ooh, what am I missing out on? And I can obviously only speak for myself, but definitely changed some things around. And supernatural fantasy is my favorite genre. So thanks, parents, I guess.
So that kind of made me think of most of the situations I've been in where a book is being, I don't even want to say challenged, it's being questioned. It will be like a young adult title that's maybe got some more adult themes. And it's really just a matter of the parent saying, hey, don't you think this would be better suited in the general collection than the YA? And sometimes we're able to make that accommodation. Like, you know what? Yeah, that's not a big deal. We can move that. I think that's especially true for graphic novels. There are some that maybe at one point would have been classified as teen graphic novels, but because that genre has expanded so much, we are able to reclassify them. And so it's not necessarily that we're taking that away from anyone. We're just making it harder to find. And some kids are going to be like Andrea and find a way. Readers find a way. And so, my perspective on that is, it really is a conversation that parents and their children need to have, not necessarily parents and their librarians. That's where the conversation needs to start, in my opinion.
And I think that the situation with graphic novels in particular is like there have been adult graphic novels around for a while. Mouse is an example of a book that's been around for decades, and is a graphic novel for adults. And we haven't always been consistent within JCLS in how we've catalog those materials. So the idea when you kind of move things around in terms of which, like, is it in teen, is it in children's, is it an adult, like that needs to be based on kind of the publisher's intent from the beginning. Like, was this written for adults? Okay, well, we can put it in adults, and it will be found by the readers who it was intended for, rather than, because there are some pretty intense graphic novels that would not, like, you wouldn't necessarily place it in a children's section, for example, like, but it's a comic, like people want to. There's a tendency to kind of take the graphic novel format and think, oh, it's like comic books. It's like, I don't know, it's like Daffy Duck. It's like, no, there's some pretty intense content in graphic novels, and recognizing what the audience that the author was trying to reach, that's really the place where it can be. And sometimes there is content in a teen section that will make some people who are not teens uncomfortable because they don't think, teens aren't ready for that yet. And I think that it's important to remember that teens are a very diverse group, and there are teens who are at all levels of maturity. And teen, if you think about that, like 12 to 18, that is a huge swath of development right there. And that everyone's going to have a different sense of where the line is. And I think, to Carrie's point, that line is defined in the home between the parent and the child, keeping in mind that sometimes, as in Andrea's case, a teen might be interested in exploring content. I mean, the classic example in library is, a child who is trying to, doesn't have access to information that will help them explore something like, an LGBT plus identity, and doesn't have the support of their parents in doing that. That speaks then now beyond what's kind of out of scope, but just to kind of show how this tangentially can kind of touch on something like, that freedom to read, where a child might really need information and have to have a certain level of privacy from their parents and their exploration of that. And often your privacy policies in a library, just separate policy than your collection policy, also has different definitions of where and how you define privacy depending on the age range of the child. Is child meaning anyone under 18?
It is a huge group. And I think even there are younger kids than 12 that come into this department because they have a really high reading level. And so it's very much in the parents to handle that. But also for us, it's like, okay, well, what do you like to read? What kind of, how can we help you find what you want in here and what you, so very specifically. And I think Kristin, you and we deal with this in the discovery group a lot, if one teen wants, I want teen romance, but the other one's like, I don't want anything even remotely close to like anything romantic. I had one kid who was like, they're holding hands, not a huge fan. Let's move on from this. And I was like, cool. So we're just not going to touch on anything romantic at all, but you're good with violence? Score. Let's get you something, let's go Maze Runner, because that's going to be good for you. It's to each their own, to be completely honest. And we're here to help guide with what we have.
Yeah. Judy Blume actually talks about kids being their own best censors. They know what they're ready for and what they're not. And I was curious about stuff before, like, and I learned things by reading. There wasn't a lot of teen literature. I'm 50. Like we had forever. That was scandalous back in the day. I remember when that was like new. And teen literature has changed quite a bit, but you know, young people do make decisions about what they're interested in, care about reading. The other thing, I think, just as a point of nuance, as we talk about this as a panel of exclusively public librarians, sometimes these conversations are different in the schools. And you will notice that a lot of the news stories about challenges do happen in the school. And some of that is a different, there's a slightly different relationship between a librarian in a school and a librarian in the public. So we do not, when a child comes into our space, have in loco parentis authority over that child. That child is an independent, completely on their, like they're an entity with their own rights, and we don't have any parental responsibility. There are parental responsibilities in a school setting, which makes the conversation slightly different when you're talking to a school librarian about the same things, but they would say many of the same things that we're saying right now.
All right, really quick before the next question, I see a couple of questions coming into chat. Definitely keep those coming. I'm going to keep going with our questions and then we'll get to those at the end. So our next one, what is your advice to others who have concerns about reading banned books?
My advice would be to go ahead and read it, because if somebody, and this is just the way I look at things, if somebody's telling me I should not read this thing, I'm going to read it because I want to know, why do you think I shouldn't read it? And if you're not going to read the whole thing, at least read a little bit of it. Form your own opinion around a title, and don't expect others to make your opinions for you. That's my key advice.
I think that's a really good point. I think we need to, you know, oftentimes, actually all the time, if you're formally challenging a book, you have to read the whole thing. And sometimes people will cherry pick. So The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is not an example of a book that one might think is a book that's likely to be challenged, but it has been. And it has been because one mom knew about one specific scene, and that one specific scene was when Henrietta Lacks discovered that she had cervical cancer. She did so because she had contact with a part of her body on which that cancerous tumor was growing. And that was apparently something that this parent thought was too much for their child. That's one piece in a very broad, fascinating book. And to encapsulate that book into that one scene, just when you talk about it that way, if you're familiar with the book is not about a woman discovering her cervical cancer. The book is about science. The book is about the relationship between the author and the descendants of Henrietta Lacks, who she was trying to learn more about. It's about so much more than that one scene. And to distill a book into a single scene without actually understanding the context of how that scene fits into the larger picture is really limiting. And so, like, read the whole thing. Don't read the scene and get shocked by the scene that may or may not be all that shocking. Read the rest of it and understand how it fits into the broader work.
I think we've used me as a cautionary tale a couple times here in this conversation because of my love of Harry Potter. But obviously, you know, yeah, but also, you know, that Harry Potter was something for me that was life-changing, but there were also a lot of books that, like, I read that I was told that I probably shouldn't, that I didn't like, and that I didn't finish because I like you said, children can be their own best censors. And I knew, I was like, hey, I'm not ready for this. And so that's, you know, read the whole thing if you're going to create a challenge or if you're going to do something like that. But also, if you know you don't want to read it or you know that you're uncomfortable with it, put it down. I had a hard time with that because I was like, I like to finish things. But if it's not for you, feel free to put it down and try something else that's a better fit. Yeah.
And to add to that, before you challenge it if it's not for you. And I know you're not suggesting that that means you would challenge a book, but think about like, but before you hit the point where you would challenge a book, hey, it's not for me. But is it a book for anybody? Because like I'm not the only audience. And so like the parents who want their children to be protected from certain content aren't necessarily thinking about their neighbor who very much wants their child to have access to that content. And so how do you reconcile those two things? And libraries tend to err on the side of providing access, tends to be what we're about.
If you don't mind, I would like to add something. As a reference librarian, I love knowing my facts. I love being able to know if somebody wants to challenge or have a conversation. I like to make sure I research and I know what what everything's about. So I like to find out, I'd like to read the book. What is the big deal? Why is everybody saying all of this? So I can, like everybody is saying, to be able to form your own opinion and also to be able to discuss the topics and the themes realistically and to really understand the impact of the book. I really think, to have that objective, I just really want to read and find out and, have a mature conversation. So I would always encourage that as well. But like everybody's saying, if it's not for you, if it's not, and you will put it down, and you don't need to make yourself miserable trudging through a book that's just not for you. So thanks.
All right, a fun question. What is your favorite book that has been challenged or banned?
I'm happy to start. So as a teen librarian, I get to read the most fun stuff in the building, in my opinion. And before I became a librarian, John Green's Looking for Alaska. It was and still is my favorite John Green book. And it has been heavily on the top 10 banned list, but hilariously, not until The Fault in Our Stars became a movie, because people weren't really paying attention to it beforehand. And then, The Fault in Our Stars came out and everybody's like, oh, this book. And then, you read a little first published book by an unknown author and there it is. So Looking for Alaska is my answer.
So mine, I love dystopian literature for any ages. I just, it's what gets me up in the morning. It's dystopian literature. And so I was looking through like the most banned books, the books that show up most often. And my favorite on that list is actually 1984 by George Orwell, because it's so ironic for it to be on the list. And I love irony just as much as I love dystopian literature. So that's my answer.
I went through the lovely list that we have on our catalog under staff picks. You can find a collection of banned books lists that Spencer created to go along with one of his blog posts. And as the children's representative, I felt like I kind of needed to maintain my cred by picking a picture book. And Where the Wild Things Are is one of those books that I don't think of as being a book that would be challenged. But here is what Spencer wrote under the notes for why it was challenged. Banned across the US for child abuse, supernatural themes, and encouraging children to be disobedient. And fun fact, I have a Max tattoo on the back of my arm, and it's from the last scene, because the point of that book is not the disobedient part. It's the part where you come home and your soup is still warm. It's so amazing. And like, it's such a wonderful book in that way. Like you can do what you want, not what you want. You can make a bad decision and you can come back to your home. And then I wish every child had this experience. I know I've had this experience that I could come home and have forgiveness waiting for me. And so that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. Now I want soup and my mom.
I'm going to mention The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I read it after the movie came out, which is actually, the book was banned a lot when it first came out, had started to see a decrease in banning, and then was challenged significantly more after the movie came out, similar to what Andrea said about John Green and why am I blanking on the name of the movie?
Fault in Our Stars.
Fault in Our Stars. Yes, Fault in Our Stars. But that's a really common trend in general. I think that also happened with Perks of Being a Wallflower, and it also happened with 13 Reasons Why is another one that when it first came out, it was challenged all the time, and then people just kind of forgot about it because it was a well-selling book, but nothing outstanding. It didn't have the staying power of something like Harry Potter. But then the Netflix show came out and it just brought it back onto everybody's radar.
I'll tell you my favorite banned book. Well, it's really tough because there's several favorites on the lists. I was going to go with Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, which was a very meaningful book when I read it. I would think I was a sophomore in high school. And it was very impactful as someone who identified as a woman, and, just some very mature themes that were really impactful to me at that age. But I'm going to have to go with To Kill a Mockingbird. That novel really taught me about how to take a step back, look at things from other perspectives, points of views, give some grace. People are all humans. And so I think that book really impacted me in just a way to empathize and sympathize with other human beings. So that one was my favorite.
I almost said Huckleberry Finn. And I want to share why. People are often like, really, you like Huck Finn? And I do, because you have this child who is in a very not safe environment. He has grown up in a world that most of us would, not survive in. And he starts off with these ideas about how life is supposed to be and who falls into what space in the hierarchy. And at the end of it, after having some positive influences in his life, some negative as well, but after having a surrogate father figure take him under his wing and protect him, he becomes a better version of himself. So that book always really touched me. So I wanted to add that to the list too.
All right, so our last planned question of the night. Do you have any last things you want to say? Other book suggestions, final thoughts, anything like that?
I do. And hold on, let me pull this up. I found this word cloud, and I want to share my screen real fast, which I think I have the ability to do that. Let's see. And so it's reasons that books are challenged. And these are specifically the words and phrases come from the 2020 censorship report. And these are the reasons that people will challenge books. And what I find most interesting is that it really comes down to kind of the topics that you can't discuss in polite company. Like what we're told, you don't talk about religion and politics at dinner. And these are the topics that are often challenged and banned. And I just think it's really fascinating to see this word cloud and where the trend is right now on what's being banned. So I wanted to share that for a moment. And I'll stop now.
I do think that word cloud is fascinating. I think it reinforces that, this conversation about banned books, it is a front in what is sometimes called the culture wars, I think. And, our own political affiliations as librarians is completely separate from this conversation. But we err on the side of access. And a saw that is commonly said in library school classes, in library trainings, there should be something in the library that offends everybody. There are definitely things in our library that offend me, and I would defend their right to be in there. There are, there are things that I also get very protective of, and if somebody were to want to take it out, I would, that's a, we tend to err on the side of keeping these things in and accessible to our patrons.
Another thing that Word Cloud made me think of, a lot of the biggest ones were like LGBTQ, racial identity or racial topics, that kind of thing, or religious minorities, etc. And one thing I touched on a blog post recently about Banned Books, getting ready for Banned Books Week, was that for the last, I think it was 5 years in a row, the 8 out of the 10 top banned books every year were from either marginalized viewpoints, authors, or main characters. And I think that's a very common trend we see that emphasizes why it's so important to have access to those. I think it's really easy for parents and people to be uncomfortable with new ideas or uncomfortable with things, like we said, that we can't talk about in polite conversation, like the racism that happens in our society or the prejudice in any variety that happens in our society. And I think that definitely shows in the books that we choose to challenge.
I kind of got stuck on the word filthy, and I was like, who uses that word? I don't, who's saying something's filthy unless they're like specifically like making a point about something. I know it definitely wasn't the biggest, and it was just kind of in there, and I was like, okay, if that's what you have to say, that's fine.
And I think that that's a really, like, if anyone watching this is thinking that they want to go and challenge a book, like, that is definitely, you're right. There's a process for it. We can hook you up, but be specific about what the thing is. Like filthy and other, like, there are adjectives that are also very arbitrary. Like, not that I'm trying to coach you on how to write a challenge, because we want to keep the books in the library. However, if you were so inclined, like, being specific about the specific thing that is, it is what is troublesome to you, and you might get pushback. Like, there are definitely people who will challenge content in books. It is far more likely that a book with two same-sex protagonists engaging in a kiss to be challenged than a hetero couple engaging in a kiss. So what does that tell you? Is it the act of kissing, or is it like, hypothetically, because typically it's more than kissing, but this is a family program, so we're gonna stick with kissing. That is it. What is the specific thing that is causing? So any challenger would be asked, like, what's the specific thing? What is it? Like, and articulate it. And we want the person who's challenging it to look at that and understand what they're actually saying, because there's lots of stuff in libraries with lots of different points of view.
Once again, I just like to add, as a reference librarian, I want to learn as much as I can. And I want to learn why things are being banned. I want to find that scene. I want to find that one scene and I want to know about it. But that's just me as someone who wants to know as much as possible. So if you have that type of drive where you really just like to know, I just encourage you to read anything and everything. Okay, so that was the last planned question of the night. And now we're going to open it up to the audience to field some questions. So feel free to type your questions that you have for the panelists in the chat box. We're going to give you a little bit of time to type. And while we do that, I'm going to add that link to the banned book lists that you heard everybody talking about that Spencer created. So this is the link to our catalog of banned books here. I'll put that there. And you should be able to log right in and put any of those titles on hold if they interest you. And so, yeah, these lists all focused on banned books and challenged books. You can check them out, like I said, or if you're not feeling up to checking them out, you can at least look up the titles and see what book titles have been at least noted as controversial, if that's something that you're interested in. But you're here, so I'm going to assume that you are. So I do have one question that was already in the chat that was waiting for you guys if you are ready.
Hit us.
All right, so we have a question. A lot of parents assume that YA books are PG without actually reading them, largely because standards and content have evolved. What do you do to reach/educate them?
One of the best tools that I have found, like if I encounter a parent who I know is concerned about the content, and there's a couple of things I typically say. One of the things is, there's this myth that the reading level is dramatically different when you move from J to teen. And so people want to be like, well, I'm an advanced reader, so it's time for me to go to YA. The defining difference between older, when I say J, I'm using industry slang or lingo. I'm talking about juvenile children's fiction that is written for, up to 6th grade, which is typically in our children's collection, versus the books that are published as YA, and YA is a publishing category that is read by teens, not by like 20-somethings, which is sometimes confusing for people. Also, sometimes people say "yeah," and that's also very funny, but that's a whole other.
You want to point out that everyone should read YA because it's awesome.
And lots of people do read YA. Yeah, it's really fascinating how popular that has become for everybody. So there's no shame. Like libraries are typically places where people shouldn't feel shame about what part of the library they read. All of us have, as adults on this panel, read children's books, read teen books, or we're kind of unabashed, just broad readers. So if you're a parent and you've got a child who is an advanced reader, just saying, hey, you should be reading in YA because you're reading at a high level, that's not necessarily the time for a parent to send a child to teen. The defining factor between a middle grade novel and a YA novel is not reading level necessarily. It is more likely to be content. And back to what we were talking about before, the intended audience. Was the intended audience to be someone older than 12 or someone younger than 12? That's kind of the difference there. And so it's not necessarily a truth that an advanced reader should just jump straight to YA. However, kids are interested in things at different levels, and parents and children have unique relationships with each other, and parents have every right to kind of have these conversations with these kids. There is a website called Common Sense Media, and in a non-judgmental, appropriate way, it helps a parent find out what topics might be in a book that they are reading. And I find that specific source to be a valuable source. It used to be a free site. I believe it is now a subscription required site, which was very devastating to librarians when we discovered that. But we use it regularly when we are dealing with questions like the one Andrea mentioned for JCLS Discovery, where you've got a teen asking for books and just not wanting romance. It's a great way to figure out whether romance is in those books or not.
One of the best things that I think about on Common Sense Media is their reviews from parents and their reviews from teens. And so you get, okay, so parents think it's for about this age group and teens think it's for about this age group. And then you can kind of see like a median in all of that. But I think it's really about maturity. Seems like a rude word because I'm not calling anyone immature, but like if those are things that you're able to handle, if you're thinking, okay, the topics in this children's book and this juvenile book are not really what I'm dealing with anymore, regardless of age, that again, and we go back to what Carrie said, and it's kind of like a discussion to have with your adults, whoever your guardian or your adult is, that's the person that, because I'm coming at this from like a teen standpoint, that's who you should be having this discussion with, not your librarian, although I'm happy to suggest things within reason.
Also, to add to what you said, something Kristin mentioned earlier about children being their own best censors. when I've looked at Common Sense Media, what the children or what the teen reviews have said the age group was and what the parent said the age group was that was best for that book are almost always very similar. I think teens really do have a good concept of what age group the book is meant for, if it's meant for them or not. That doesn't always mean that if it's not meant for them, they're going to stop reading it. But I think they do have a good grasp for what is for them and what isn't.
You gotta love those teens. People underestimate them, but they're pretty great.
You know, what I think about is all of the wonderful conversations I had with my mom when I was a teen, because I would read something and my mom let me read anything I wanted. I mean, I was reading Mary Higgins Clark at like 14. And so, you know, there really were no limits, but I would come to her like, Mom, I read this and I have questions. and so she would have the conversation. You know, we talked about everything. And so I hope that other people get to have those opportunities with their parents or their children. I know that's not the case everywhere. So what I would say for parents, if they're not willing to read the same books as their kids, because some parents want to do that. They want to read it first and then say, okay, yeah, you can read this. If you don't want to do that, use reviews. Go online and look up what other people are saying about it. That really is the best way to educate yourself and maybe be prepared for when your kid says, hey, Mom, I saw a thing. and I have questions.
Not all teens, you. However, so my parents, I'm 50, so I'm of a different generation than the other panelists. And from my experience was teen wasn't really a publishing category. Like The Outsiders had been published. The Outsiders is kind of one of those books that's kind of considered a seminal YA kind of, this is the beginning of YA, but there wasn't a lot except for Sweet Valley High. My parents were like, you're reading at a high level. We need to find adult books for you. And I love my parents. They're very caring and supportive parents. They were not bad parents in any stretch of the imagination. But what they did was they said, okay, you can read any Stephen King with a main character who is a child. That's Firestarter, that's Shining, that's It. This was what I read as a middle schooler and high schooler. It probably explains a lot of things about me. I loved it. I did not always ask my mom when I saw things in those books that made me recognize that maybe I wasn't quite ready for this content. I was definitely fascinated, but we all kind of explore, like, and we grow up and we're fine. Like, it's all good.
On a somewhat similar notion, Kristin, I grew up with 4 older sisters. And they were all very advanced readers. So youngest sister here would always, you got to get your hands on their novels, and they were into romance novels pretty deep. And so, you know, kids are our own sense, you know, we can censor ourselves. But I was also that kid that was like, whoa, I don't get this, but my sisters really like it and I need to know more. But once again, I think it just goes to show I'm a reference librarian who always wants to know. So, you know, when you have older siblings too, sometimes it gets you hands on a little bit more titles. So that's, I guess, something to keep in mind if you have multiple kiddos in the house. Okay, we have an interesting question in chat. How can I challenge a challenge?
So in library circles, that tends to be finding out which library system, what school system is experiencing a challenge, and finding out how to support that community or that, you know, how to lift up the voices and support the people who are actively in the community trying to defend that material. So that's that I think is, I mean, that's what librarians, we're pretty aware when challenges happen. Authors post on Twitter when their materials are challenged. other librarians post on Twitter, and being a part of that conversation and figuring out what the community needs. And if something were to happen in Jackson County, final decisions typically happen at the board meeting. Our board meetings are public. There is time for public comment. So certainly if that was on the agenda, there would be an opportunity for members of the community to raise their voice. We have not, to my knowledge, handled a full challenge process in that way, where it's gotten to the point where we needed to approach the board for consideration, though.
And just to echo what Kristin was saying, it's about supporting that community. In preparing for tonight, I was reading about the situation in Pennsylvania with the books that were being. I think it was very interesting how the school board chose to say they're on a freeze. They haven't been banned, they're on a freeze. But local groups started purchasing copies of those books to put in free little libraries. And, it really is a fun way to kind of be a little subversive. People don't realize how subversive librarians are. We'll find a way to slip it to you. and look for ways for the community to really speak out to what their values are.
Again, in my research, I grabbed this book off of my shelf today. Everybody looks like they've read it, all of my panelists. It's so good. It is a book about a girl who loves to read and whose parents decide they're not about it, and they clear out basically the entirety of her middle school library. And so she finds a little library and she starts running her own underground library from her locker, and somehow becomes the most popular person at school because people just want to get their hands on books. And so she's doing basically what Carrie was talking about was happening in Pennsylvania, and just doing it right under everybody's noses. And highly suggest. This is a prize copy that we have, but we do have copies in the collection, property of the Rebel Librarian. So just gonna, tell you all to read that one.
I just have to say, I love how we're finding different ways to plug our library's resources with almost every answer, because we legitimately love what we do.
So we have another question in the chat. As a person who grew up reading Dr. Seuss, what are your thoughts as librarians regarding his writing viewed through a modern lens?
As the children's representative, I'm going to vote to or suggest that I go first. I kind of thought about the fact that this one might come up because it's this really interesting intersection of when we talk about banned and challenged books, because there's this opposite, it's different. It's different because it's being disavowed by the author's estate. It's being disavowed by the publisher. We did keep the books in our collection. There are different things that we can do, but this is part of a broader conversation. And Dr. Seuss was not until recently the first book that came up when you talked about seasoned classics that have content that has not stood the test of time. The book that until, this year was brought up was typically Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie, which does have the phrase repeated in it, though, and I'm going to say it out loud, and I apologize if anyone finds this triggering, but the phrase is "the only good Indian is a dead Indian." That is clearly offensive. Actually, if you go deeper into Little Town on the Prairie, there is a scene in which Pa performs in blackface. There is an illustration of him performing in blackface within the book. So there are things in what are considered classic kids literature that the world has moved on and kind of thinks these are not the imagery that in Dr. Seuss that tends to land at, that is kind of racially racial stereotyping caricatures is really the kind of one of the big offenders in the list of books of his. And it wasn't all of his books, it was just those 5 that they stopped publishing. And we tend to want to protect kids. And I've thought a lot about this because we want to protect kids, and my wanting to protect kids from images that are racist, and specifically the kids who are from the identity groups who are caricatured in these books, like that, like the idea of, a child with indigenous heritage being asked to read Little House on the Prairie feels like inappropriate, and like that. So there's this, but that same thinking is the same thinking that, or the same argument, like protecting kids, that at a point where there was more, like back in the day, because the early books about LGBT identities, you had King and King and Heather Has Two Mommies. Neither one of them is a particularly good picture book. They were just the only two. And you wanted to have them in your collection, so you had something, even though they weren't good. We now have much better books. Julian is a Mermaid. There are beautiful books that explore LGBT plus identities in different ways. But how the argument the argument is deployed is slightly different. My personal, and this is definitely sliding into personal, because it's not what we have done, but I do think that there is space, specifically in the case of materials that have been disavowed by, when it's an estate, you can say that's been disavowed by the author, disavowed by the publisher, that there is historical interest in that book. There is clearly still demand for these books, but maybe browsing in the children's picture bookshelf is not 100% the right place for that to be located. And there might be other collections. This is a book of historical interest that definitely parents still read, and their kids, they still want their kids to read. And I've talked to numerous parents who have explored Little House on the Prairie as adults with their young children, and recognized that there were things in those books that they didn't recognize or see that now make them uncomfortable. And they have really interesting conversations with their kids now about them, but like, had they known before they started, they might not have even approached that book with their kids. So it's a really complicated conversation, and we do want to provide access to books that have an interest and that children want to read. But there's nuance in this conversation, and the Seuss conversation is new, and we're still figuring out the answer to that, I think. That's enough for me. Sorry about that.
So I just want to add to that. And I can't remember, Kristin, maybe you can remind me, did we decide to move those to the adult nonfiction?
That's always been what I've said in any meeting, but I believe we just kept them.
Okay.
So if you're not in the know about library stuff, the 800s in the Dewey Decimal System used to be where all of the fiction lived, but now it's just where plays and poetry live. But there is a way that you could theoretically pop a picture book with content that is. So there is a book that is used for reading, or a guide that is used in librarianship called the, oh my God, how did I just lose it? It's a weeding manual. It has a name. My brain has stopped working because I've been talking too much. This happens to me sometimes. But it does suggest that inappropriate racial representation is a valid reason in the profession of librarianship for weeding. And that is definitely true, but we've got this problem with this material that is popular and people want to access. Providing access through the adult nonfiction collection is a viable alternative.
And so what I wanted to say as the adult selector, as the adult selector, was that, I could obviously make the case that those books could be moved to the Seuss books specifically could be moved to the adult nonfiction area. At the same time that this Dr. Seuss conversation was happening, there were also books by Pilkey, Ook and Gluck is what the book is called. And the author was like, I don't want libraries to have this anymore. I don't want it to be out. Get rid of your copies. Because he realized that there were things in it that were not appropriate. and were racially insensitive. That book, on the other hand, I could not find a justification for moving Ook and Gluck to the adult nonfiction area because it just doesn't have the historical significance of a Dr. Seuss. So, there are so many nuances in this conversation that, really take a lot of thought. And it's not an easy decision to make because we always want to err on the side of access. But when that access is harmful in a very real way, how do you make that decision? And then I could also, make the argument that if we always remove a book because the author's estate, family, whatever, decided to pull it, what do we do when an author who was from a marginalized community, let's, for an example, say LGBTQ, and their family decides after they've died, we don't agree with anything they published, we want that removed? Do we make that same decision? And so, you have to weigh the pros and cons on both sides. And there were a lot of conversations around this topic, a lot of tears shed that no librarian thinks, oh, I'm going to cry about this topic today. And then you end up doing it because it really is a battle kind of within yourself and within the community at large, and it's a conversation that's worth having. And, I guess we haven't really come to a full solution, but this is where these conversations matter.
So along this, oh,
sorry,
go
I was
ahead,
just going to add in
Andrea.
that our Dr. Seuss is still in the children's department, but Carrie left it on a very good note, so that's all I'm going to say.
Wonderful. So it looks like a somewhat similar question. On that same thread, what are your thoughts on To Train Up a Child by the Pearls? In a number of communities, it is considered a manual promoting child abuse.
I'll admit that I have heard of it, but I have no actual knowledge of it myself, other than that I've heard things. And so I don't want to speak on something that I have nothing to say.
I'm over here searching it because it is also something that I am not familiar with. I see references to the controversy around it, and I think that this kind of see, this is where we recognize how hard conversations each one of these things is, because we each have and child abuse is something that has a legal definition, and we certainly so the question become this is a really hard question to answer, and I think that my juddering here is probably communicating that more than any words that come together would be. Child abuse is I'm not going to say saying anything that everyone here is agree with this. Child abuse is horrible. It should not happen. It is illegal. A book that is a manual for how to engage in abuse of children would be highly problematic and not necessarily something we would want to be a part of our collection. Some books can mask themselves as there are materials that are geared towards people with specific strongly held beliefs. It does appear that this is written by somebody with a specific religious belief in place. We probably have people in our communities who also are a part of those religions. So then much like my political affiliation might make some books offensive, and it's different than political affiliation. I'm not trying to, God, this is why it's so complicated. I can't say it, like it's an illegal, reprehensible activity to engage in child abuse, but how do you get to the level of specifically what it's advocating for that is illegal? And we would need to review that book and look at it. And this is not a good answer to the question because I'm not necessarily taking a stance on it. But I'm seeing notes come in and about it here from a patron. So I want to stop and read it, so I'm more informed. And I'm going to let Carrie chime in now.
Yes, I have actually never heard of this book before, and I immediately looked it up to see if we have it in our collection, and we do. What I would say when we're talking about how we read books, if a book has been checking out, unless it's brought to our attention what's in it, especially in those nonfiction books that are, there's so many. If a book is checking out, it's not until we've really been notified of an issue that we think, okay, we should look at the content of it a little more closely and make the decision to pull it out of our collection. I'm making a note right now to talk to our collection development librarian and say, how do we find these books that are in our collection without people having to raise awareness? But thank you for pointing out that we do have this book, and I will be looking at it now. I'm not saying yes, we're going to take it out because somebody challenged it in this program. I'm saying we need to look at it and make that decision. If it's, inaccurate information, if it's outdated information, it might be time to pull it. But I'm going to guess, and this is just a guess, but the reason it's still in there is because it has been checked out sometime in the last 5 years. So somebody in our community wanted to read it.
But the other piece that we need to remember in these cases is that based on that title, and that it's possible that someone checked it out without recognizing that. And I'm quoting from comments here, not because it talks about what types of PVC pipes it's okay to beat one's child with, because that is not the sort of thing we want a how-to guide out in our community. And so we need to look at these and think about whether they still belong. And one thing that I often talk to, because this came up a lot during Seuss, our policies have been created to protect and allow us to keep content in. They have not been set up because the general thinking is more access, more books. Let's build this big tent and even in a world where we recognize the power and the danger of, unimpaired freedom of speech is super important. We're First Amendment institutions kind of at our core, but our policies are not written to help us figure out how to identify materials that time might have passed or might never have been appropriate, or we might just be smarter now. And the building of the policy is something that we need to look at now as we're starting to encounter conversations like the one we're having right now, like the one about Seuss. How do we do this in a way that continues to provide access when appropriate, but may actually just take some things out of the equation?
The one thing I would like to add, I never pronounce this guy's name right. Ragnathan. There are like these 5 laws of librarianship, and the ones that are most relevant to this conversation, I do have these pulled up because I love them. Books are for use. Every reader, their book. So there's a book, or every reader has a book that's for them. Every book has its reader. We as librarians should save the time of the reader And then this one I think is really important for this conversation. The library is a growing organism. It's always changing. Some might say we're slow to change, but we're always changing. And it's through conversations like this that we're able to move forward.
Well, thank you for that lovely ending note, Carrie. So it's about 7:27, and so we haven't received any new questions in the chat. So thank you all for attending our program tonight. This concludes our Banned Books panel, and thank you to our panelists, and thank you everyone for showing up and attending, and thank you, Spencer, for being my co-host. Y'all have a great night.